Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video for requirement number 1 of the sewing badge. So let's get right into it. So when you're thinking about sewing, you need to think about what tools you need to use. And the first tool that comes to my mind is a pair of scissors. Now it's important to use fabric scissors when sewing because they're much more efficient and cut through the fabric nicely. And it's important not to use your fabric scissors on anything but fabric so that you have nice sharp scissors for a long time. Next we have measuring tape. I like to keep 2 measuring tapes. The first one is around 120 inches, and as you can see, it's pretty big, so I use it for the larger projects. On the back you can see it's in centimeters for the smaller dimensions, and I really like this measuring tape because it affords the large projects without having to use a really small one and repeat and make room for error. The second one I have goes to 60 inches, and I use this for smaller projects. But as a beginner, it's best just to start with a smaller measuring tape because it makes your cleanup time a lot easier. Now we have pinking shears. Pinking shears are used to help deter fabrics that fray. Now what you do is you cut the end of fabric with the pinking shears, and the zigzag shape that you see that's cut into the metal helps it to deter from fraying. And I can attest to the fact that these help and make your sewing life a lot easier. Now we have pins. Pins are pretty self-explanatory, really. We use them to pin fabric together when sewing. So an example might be when you're pinning a pattern to some fabric. You could etch it around, but if you don't want to leave any marks on there and you don't feel like washing the fabric, you use pins. And it's important about your pin placement, though, because when you're hand sewing and when you're machine sewing, it's very different. So when you're hand sewing, you want to do it horizontally, and when you're machine sewing, you want to do it vertically. Why? Well, when you're hand sewing, you want to pin your pins horizontally because it makes it a lot easier on your hands. It's very hard to get pricked by a pin constantly when it's going vertically than opposed to horizontally. And of course, you keep these all in a pin cushion. Next, we have a needle and thread, the classic staple of sewing. Now, this is how you open a needle case because it has a little clear lid on it with a hole, and you use that hole to slide around and you take your needle out. Next, we have a seam ripper. A seam ripper is used to rip seams. So let's say you're hand sewing and you don't like how wonky your seams are. What you'll do is you'll take your seam ripper and rip the seams and start again. It's very useful, and I'll be demonstrating how to use that in the next video. So next we have a thimble. A thimble is kind of like a golf ball. It has all those little dimples, and those dimples on the thimble help to give some leverage when you're sewing. So if you're sewing through some really thick fabric and your fingers just aren't standing the test of getting pricked so much, you use a thimble to give you that extra leverage and provide some stability. Next we have tailor's chalk. Now what I have is a pencil, but it completes the same purpose as tailor's chalk. It's made for marking and it's washable. So there are primarily 2 colors that you get tailor's chalk in, blue and white. White is for the darker colors and blue is for colors like white. And what it does is that it helps you to mark what you need to sew, like sewing lines. It helps you to mark what you need to cut, and it washes out so that you don't see it after you're done making your project. Next we have bobbins. Yes, bobbins. Bobbins are made for sewing machines. Sewing machines have 2 different parts where you put thread on the bottom and the top. The bobbin is the part that goes on the bottom. And that's what one that's filled looks like, and that's what the other 2 are empty look like. Now we have thread. These are spools of thread. Now thread is kind of like a little tiny rope, but it's very delicate and easy to break if you don't use it correctly. Now the larger ones are primarily for sewing machines, and the smaller ones are usually for hand sewing. And so how you store your thread is important because you don't want it to get tangled. So if you notice here, there's like a little spike coming out, if you will. It's like an indentation, like they cut the plastic. And what that does is it helps you to store your thread and store the end of the thread so that you don't get a tangled mess of thread. Now we have a zipper. Zipper comes in all sorts of colors and sizes and for different purposes. So this one I got for just $1, and it's an all-purpose zipper. And it's very useful for small projects. You might see a zipper on the back of a dress, the back of a skirt, on a jacket. Now, one of my favorite parts of sewing are the buttons. There are all sorts of buttons. When you think about it, what do you think when you see a button? Do you see one with 4 holes? Do you see one with 2 holes? Or do you see a decorative button like I have right in front with just like a little plastic loop for you to connect it to? And so it's important that you know how to sew a button on. So for example, we have this 4-hole button, and then you have these decorative buttons where it's just like a little loop. And so it's always a challenge trying to figure out how to sew on your button without ruining the structural integrity of the garment or adding any weird puckering lines where you're sewing. And I'll be demonstrating how to sew buttons on in the next video. So now we have patterns. Patterns come in all sorts of designs, and they're very interesting to work with because it's certainly a challenge. It'll tell you its difficulty level. It'll tell you what the garment will look like. It'll tell you what size you need. It'll tell you how much fabric you need for the size that you want to make. It'll tell you the notions, which means buttons, thread, elastic, whatever you need to make it. You can make shirts. You can make dresses. You can have vintage patterns from the 40s, 50s, 60s. You can make hats and purses and gloves. You can make costumes for any period of time. And you can also make costumes for men and clothing for men. And so you can make so many things with them, and there's different brands. You have Butterick, you have Simplicity, you have McCall's, you have Vogue. There's so many different pattern brands, and they all have something different to offer. It's almost like a challenge looking on the back of one to figure out how they go about explaining how to use them. Now we have Velcro. I'm sure you've seen this on your shoes before. And, well, Velcro when you're sewing is a little bit different than when you just wear it. Because Velcro takes 2 parts to sew it on. It's almost like a zipper. But it can be adhesive, so you just peel off the back and stick it on. It can be sewed on, and it can be ironed on. Just depends on what you have. So next we have some felt. I almost don't classify this as fabric because felt is so completely different from most fabrics that it's quite interesting to work with when you think about it. And so it's pretty thick. A lot of us use it for crafting purposes, and it's very sturdy and reliable. Now we have elastic. Now this is kind of very sought after nowadays with the whole state of things now. But elastic is, I mean, you've probably seen elastic before. It can be in your waistband. It can be in the waistband of a dress or skirt. It can be in your socks. We see elastic everywhere, and it's very interesting, almost like searching for where you can find elastic nowadays. So now we have ribbons. One of my favorite parts of sewing are the ribbons because you have so many artistic abilities with them. You can sew them onto curtains. You can sew them onto pillowcases. You can tie them in your hair. You can add them to dresses. You can add like a sash with a ribbon to your dress. There's so many different things to do with them, and there's so many different types of ribbons. You have silk ribbons, you have lace ribbons, all sorts of ribbons, and it's always fun working with them. So next we have lace. And I have 2 types of lace. This first lace is a nice white lace. It's very delicate. And the second lace that I have is a bit stiffer. It, as you can see, it's the white lace. It comes in all different colors, and the darker lace is a bit stiffer. So you can see when it drapes over my hand, it definitely shows how stiff and soft it is. So it's always important to make sure that you're using the right type of lace with your project. Now we have double fold bias tape. Now what do you use double fold bias tape for? Well, a lot of times I use double fold bias tape for finishing off a project. So on the ends, instead of hemming it, maybe I'll put some bias tape on it to add that extra bit of flair. Or you can put it on a pillowcase, on the ends of a pillowcase. It's very common. And so you can see here, it's basically like a ribbon, but oftentimes it's made out of cotton, and it's folded, and so it provides that extra easy, it gives you that extra ability to really hasten the amount of time that it takes to sew it, rather than just cutting out a piece of fabric. And it can be triple folded also, so it comes in all sorts of colors and sizes. Now we have cording. Cording is kind of like bias tape, but it has, as it says in its name, a bit of cording. So you primarily use cording for like pillows. You can use it in pillows where you have it around the edge. And when you fold it open, it's like stitched at the end so that you have this cord so it doesn't unravel. And so you can see a little bit more when it's on the container. So thank you for watching. This is the end of video 1 for requirement number 1, and please be sure to watch the second video. Thank you.